and a former pharmaceutical industry executive. William Soliman, the US buying up most of the world's supply of this drug, remdesivir, is that fair?
Well, one of the things I think we need to make sure we separate is Gilead from U.S. policy. Gilead itself, and in full disclosure, I was an executive with Gilead Sciences, is very committed to patients and to making sure that as many patients as possible have access to remdesivir. I think really the question comes down to some of the basic code of ethical standards related to patient access to medications, especially those patients that are perhaps in developing countries that are also suffering from COVID-19, and making sure that from a manufacturing perspective, those patients get the medications they need.
Okay, let's talk about patient access. This is not a cheap drug, but already the chatter surrounding this news, this development on the US buying most of this drug, is basically saying it's not cheap. A course of this drug, 5 or 6 vials, will set you back about $2,500 US, or more to the point, within the framework of the US medical system, your insurance company pays for it. What if you're one of those people who's lost your job, you've got no money, you're one of the 35, 40 million unemployed, you don't have any insurance? How do you get the drug?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I think we know, at least in the United States, those individuals who don't have private insurance, it's going to be a little bit more challenging for them. But I can say from the pharmaceutical industry side, there are programs that are available to help patients have access to these types of medications. So most pharmaceutical companies have these types of compassionate use programs where they allow patients to be able to access the drugs as long as they meet some type of criteria when it comes to their finances and the income that they have. And I think, from a manufacturing perspective, we know that Gilead Sciences has contracted with several drug makers in some of the developing countries. And you have to keep in mind, too, they are lowering the cost. They set a lower price in the developing countries versus the U.S. So I think they are doing what they can to ensure that those patients do have access to the drug. And I know that that's in contrast, for example, with the stance that AstraZeneca has, which is another company that now is in phase 3 in terms of vaccine development for COVID-19, where they're looking to make the drug much more widely available. So I do think, again, it calls into question this whole issue of, are these wealthier countries like the United States going to kind of have dibs on the vaccine versus other countries that are, in a more precarious position economically, but still have, the same need from a public health perspective.
Could this become, for all the wrong reasons, something of a boom industry, in as much as for a company such as Gilead, you used to work for them, you're telling us, how easy is it for a company like that to ramp up production? Because if all their stock they know has been sold 3 months down the line, can they just get another production line? Can they just increase the process?
I know that they have some limitations from a manufacturing capacity perspective, and there's a number of issues involved in vaccine production that I think the public in general may not be as aware of. You have to keep in mind that you're looking at a population in the U.S. of over 300 million. That initial round that they basically secured with Gilead from the U.S. government's perspective really takes into account about 500,000 treatment courses within U.S. hospitals, right? But like I mentioned earlier, there are plans in place to try to scale up some of the European nations. I know for a fact many of the patients that were in the early clinical trials came from the UK. So I know that there's kind of been, an outcry in some of the European nations which have said, hey, look, we've been involved in the clinical trials early on, and now we're not going to have access to it. And that can be disappointing. But I think more than anything, to me, this could be potentially a signal more of the unwillingness of some governments to cooperate with other countries and to ensure that patients get the medications that they need. And I think from an ethical perspective, we need to look at that carefully.
Okay, William Soliman, good to talk to you, Mr. Soliman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.